December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America watched in horror as the sky itself turned against them. Japanese bombers moved freely above the ocean, untouchable, unstoppable. Anti-aircraft fire roared from ships below, but most shells burst harmlessly in empty air. The gunners could only watch, helpless, as the Pacific burned. In those chaotic hours, one truth became clear. If America couldn't control the sky, it would lose the war. But in the laboratories of Washington, inside sealed rooms guarded tighter than any base, a handful of scientists were working on something no one thought possible. A fuse that could think. A device so small it could fit inside a shell, yet smart enough to detonate when an enemy plane came close. To make it work, it had to survive 20,000 GS of force, endure fire, heat, and shock, and still be intelligent enough to kill. This is the story of that fuse. The proximity fuse. The invisible hand that turned American artillery into a storm of death and saved countless lives. Because in war, victory isn't always won by strength or courage. Sometimes it's won by the minds who dare to change the impossible. Let's go back to the moment when science became a soldier. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun rose over Oahu like any other Sunday. The sailors of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were still half asleep. Uniforms unbuttoned, coffee cups steaming beside their bunks. Then, at 7:55 a.m., the sky began to scream. Out of the eastern horizon came a wave of Japanese aircraft, 353 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. Within minutes, the peaceful harbor transformed into a furnace of steel and flame. Battleships exploded like volcanoes. Columns of smoke rose thousands of feet high. Men dove into burning oil slicks, their uniforms melting against their skin. Below the chaos, American gunners did what they were trained to do: fight back. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of smoke and noise. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Shell after shell burst too soon, or too late, or not at all. The Japanese planes flew through the explosions untouched, ghosts dancing in clouds of shrapnel. Only a handful were shot down. The sailors on deck watched in disbelief. They were aiming straight, but their weapons were blind. The U.S. Navy had discovered the cruel truth about its defenses. Traditional timed and impact fuses were almost useless against fast, high-altitude aircraft. To hit a moving plane, a gunner had to predict not only where it would be, but when his shell would reach that point, all in the middle of combat chaos. Even for the best-trained crews, it was nearly impossible. In those few, terrible hours, America's faith in its artillery died. When the attack ended, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Battleships lay capsized in the harbor. The Pacific Fleet, the pride of U.S. naval power, had been shattered. But deep within the wreckage, another kind of war began, a war of science. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government called on its best scientific minds to find answers. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, summoned a small group of physicists and engineers to a new, secret division, Section T. Their mission sounded absurd, even suicidal. Create a fuse that can sense a target and explode when it gets close. Dr. Merle Tuve, a quiet, brilliant physicist from the Carnegie Institution, was put in charge. When he heard the challenge, he didn't laugh. He just nodded and said, "We can try." Tuve understood the scale of what was being asked. A shell fired from an anti-aircraft gun experiences 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to crush a human body into paste. Inside that shell, any fragile electronic device would be instantly destroyed. And yet, that's exactly what the Navy wanted: a tiny radar inside a bullet. A device that could send out radio waves, detect the reflection from an approaching plane, and trigger detonation at the perfect distance, automatically. To most scientists, it sounded like science fiction. To Tuve, it was an engineering problem. Section T worked in secrecy, night and day. They weren't soldiers, but their battle was no less dangerous. The challenge wasn't just creating a miniature radar system. It was keeping it alive through the violence of launch. Every component, vacuum tubes, circuits, power cells, had to survive the unimaginable stress of being fired from a cannon at supersonic speed. They tested, failed, and tried again. Each time a fuse shattered under pressure, Tuve reminded his team, "If we make this work, we can change the war." And the war was changing fast. In the Pacific, Japanese bombers still terrorized Allied fleets. In Europe, German Luftwaffe aircraft rained destruction on cities and convoys. American gunners fought bravely, but their shells still missed, again and again. Every day, the need for a smarter fuse grew more desperate. The first experimental prototypes were ready. Tuve's team loaded a small batch into Navy test guns. The scientists stood behind protective barriers as the guns fired. Shells screamed across the sky, vanished into the clouds, and then, boom! A perfect detonation, near the target drone, not on impact. It worked. One shell, one test, one miracle. But Tuve didn't celebrate. He simply whispered, again, they needed consistency. They needed reliability. Weeks turned into months of trial and error. The scientists replaced fragile glass vacuum tubes with ruggedized versions that could survive launch shock. They redesigned circuits, adjusted frequencies, and found ways to mass-produce components that once had to be hand-built. Slowly, impossibility began to turn into reality. By late 1942, whispers of a new weapon reached Navy officials. If it truly worked, it could change everything: anti-aircraft defense, ship protection, even artillery on land. But secrecy was absolute. The project was classified higher than the Manhattan Project itself. If the Japanese or Germans ever learned how it worked, they could design countermeasures instantly. So only a few high-ranking officers were told. To everyone else, it was just another improved fuse. The men who would one day fire those shells had no idea they were about to hold the future in their hands. After a year of testing and refinement, the proximity fuse was finally ready for combat. The first shipment was loaded onto Navy ships heading for the Pacific. One of them was the USS Helena, a light cruiser with a seasoned crew and a score to settle. Their mission would mark the first time in history that radar-guided shells will be fired in war. In a few short weeks, the enemy would learn what it meant when science and steel united, and when every gun became a hunter. January 5, 1943, Solomon Islands, South Pacific. The sea was calm that evening, deceptively calm. On board the USS Helena, the crew stood at their battle stations, scanning the dark horizon. The sun had vanished beyond the jungle-clad islands, and the sound of engines echoed in the distance. The radar screens flickered with movement. Japanese bombers were coming. This wasn't Helena's first fight. She had survived Pearl Harbor, repaired, refitted, and sent back to the Pacific for revenge. But tonight, something was different. Deep inside her ammunition stores were hundreds of shells carrying an experimental fuse, one that could sense its target. Most of the crew didn't know what made these shells special. They only knew the scientists had promised. These will see for you. As the first Japanese planes appeared, the ship's guns thundered to life. Tracer rounds streaked through the humid air. The night lit up in orange flashes. Normally, anti-aircraft gunners would watch helplessly as their shells burst too far or too soon. But this time, they saw something new: explosions right next to the enemy planes. One after another, Japanese bombers vanished in midair, shredded by invisible hands. The Helena's radar operators couldn't believe it. Dozens of shells fired, and the accuracy was unbelievable. Within minutes, the attack was over. Not a single bomb had struck the ship. For the first time, American sailors looked at their guns and realized they had a weapon that could think for itself. The proximity fuse had drawn its first blood. Word spread across the fleet like wildfire. Ships that had once feared enemy air raids now wanted the new shells immediately. Officers described it as a miracle weapon. One admiral said, "It's like every gun suddenly grew eyes." But what seemed like a miracle was the result of relentless human brilliance and sacrifice. Dr. Merle Tuve received the combat report with trembling hands. His team had worked for over a year without sleep, driven by faith alone. Now, The impossible had been proven in battle. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just sat in silence for a moment, knowing what this meant. The war had changed forever. The Navy immediately ordered mass production. But the challenge was staggering. Each fuse contained over 100 precision components, miniature vacuum tubes, oscillators, and sensors, all of which had to survive shock, heat, and moisture. Factories in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey converted overnight into secret assembly lines. Over 80,000 workers, mostly women, were trained to build the delicate devices. They didn't know what they were making, only that it was for the war. Every finished fuse was tested, sealed, and packed like treasure. Each was a technological masterpiece, the brain of a new generation of weapons. As more proximity fuse shells reached the fleet, Japanese pilots began noticing something terrifying. Their old tactics, high-altitude bombing runs, dive attacks, even formation flying, stopped working. Ships that once struggled to defend themselves now filled the air with precision explosions. One Japanese pilot reportedly radioed before his death. "The Americans have made the air explode." By the end of the summer, the balance had shifted. U.S. Navy task forces could now sail into enemy territory with far less fear of air attack. The Japanese command initially dismissed reports of smart shells as American propaganda. But soon, the losses became undeniable. Entire bomber squadrons vanished before they could release their payloads. The Imperial Navy realized something extraordinary had happened. Admiral Ernest King was briefed on the Fuze's combat success. His message to Tuve's team was short and simple. "You have given us control of the skies." But Tuve had one request: absolute secrecy. He insisted that no proximity fuse shells ever be used over land, where an unexploded one could fall into enemy hands. The Germans were brilliant engineers. If they discovered how it worked, the advantage would vanish overnight. So, while the Navy unleashed the new weapon in the Pacific, the Army held its fire. The secret had to be protected at all costs. With the proximity fuse in action, the American fleet turned defense into dominance. At Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville, Japanese air attacks that once crippled Allied ships now failed catastrophically. The Helena wasn't alone anymore. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships all carried the new shells. Each time Japanese aircraft approached, the sky erupted in perfectly timed detonations, clouds of shrapnel tearing through engines and wings. What once took hundreds of shells now required only a few. Accuracy had become lethality. The Japanese began calling it the ghost weapon. Their pilots whispered that American guns could see in the dark. They weren't entirely wrong. The proximity fuse had made radar a weapon, not just a sensor. By year's end, the statistics were staggering. Anti-aircraft accuracy had improved by over 400%. American losses from air raids dropped dramatically. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy could strike anywhere in the Pacific with confidence. The men who had once watched helplessly as bombs fell now stood tall, knowing the tide had turned. And back home, the scientists of Section T kept pushing. They knew the fuse could do more than defend ships. It could make artillery just as deadly. If a shell could detonate near a target in the air, why not on the ground? Why not use it to shred enemy infantry, tanks, or fortifications with perfect timing? The fuse had proven it could survive the fury of naval combat. Now, it would go to war on land, where the enemy least expected it. The fuse that could think was no longer an experiment. It was a revolution, and as 1944 approached, America prepared to unleash it not just over the sea, but across Europe, where an even greater storm was gathering. Snow blanketed the capital as scientists, officers, and generals gathered inside a secure conference room at the Navy Department. The war had turned in America's favor across the Pacific, thanks to a secret weapon known only to a select few. But now, new plans were forming, dangerous plans. Dr. Merle Tuve stood beside a table stacked with technical drawings of the proximity fuse. Across from him sat General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Tuve spoke quietly but confidently. Gentlemen, the fuse that protects our ships can now protect our soldiers." The room went silent. For over a year, the proximity fuse had been a Navy-only secret, a ghost weapon that ruled the sea. But as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, the Army needed something new, something devastating. Tuve proposed the unthinkable, equipping land artillery shells with the proximity fuse. If successful, it would allow ground troops to detonate shells in the air above enemy positions, raining shrapnel downward like steel hail. No more guessing distances, no more wasted fire. Every shell would become a deadly cloud of precision death. General Marshall leaned forward. "Can it survive the shock of field artillery?" Tuve's reply was calm. "It already has." The first Army trials began under tight secrecy. Scientists and soldiers stood side by side in muddy fields as 105mm and 155mm shells were loaded with the new fuses. When the guns fired, the earth shook. Shells arced high into the sky and then exploded perfectly just above the target. No more guessing. No more wasted ammunition. Observers watched as test dummies and sandbag emplacements were torn apart from above. The results were so devastating that one officer muttered, "This isn't artillery anymore. It's lightning." The U.S. Army had just discovered a new kind of firepower, airburst artillery. As Allied forces stormed the beaches under a rain of German fire, the proximity fuse remained a hidden secret, still too precious to risk falling into enemy hands. But its time was coming. Behind the front lines, thousands of crates marked Fuse VT were waiting for the order that would change warfare forever. That order would come 6 months later, in the dead of winter. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Snow and fog covered the forests of the Ardennes. The Allies thought the Germans were finished. Exhausted, retreating, beaten. They were wrong. From the mist, German tanks and infantry poured through the trees, launching a surprise counterattack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Caught off guard, American forces were pushed back. Communications broke down, supplies ran short, and the skies were too cloudy for Allied aircraft to help. The situation was desperate. That's when General Omar Bradley and General Patton made a daring decision. Use the fuse. The order went out. Deploy VD fuses to the front. Hundreds of artillery batteries received the secret shells. The gunners were told only one thing: do not let the enemy capture one intact. The first barrage began at dawn. The German infantry advanced across the snow-covered fields, confident in their numbers and the storm that kept Allied planes grounded. Then the sky erupted. Shells exploded above them, not on impact, but in the air, raining steel fragments in every direction. The snow turned black with smoke and shrapnel. Entire German formations vanished in seconds. Soldiers dropped their weapons and ran, shouting that the Americans were using radio bombs. But there was no bomb, no magic, just science and a fuse that could think. Reports flooded in. German attacks had stalled. Casualties were catastrophic. The fuse had turned defensive lines into killing fields. Patton called it the greatest artillery improvement of the war. General Bradley wrote, "The proximity fuse saved the lives of countless American soldiers." Even General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, later admitted, the proximity fuse was one of the 3 great inventions that won the war. The other 2, radar and the atomic bomb. The secret was now in the open, but it didn't matter. The Germans had no time to react. Proximity fuse shells followed retreating Wehrmacht units through France, the Netherlands, and into Germany itself. Each barrage was devastatingly precise. In fog, rain, or darkness, it didn't matter. The fuse could sense its target and detonate with machine-like perfection. For the first time in history, artillery fire didn't just hit, it hunted. As Allied forces crossed into the heart of Germany, commanders reflected on how close they had come to disaster just months earlier. Without the proximity fuse, the Battle of the Bulge might have ended very differently. The weapon that began as a desperate scientific gamble in 1942 had now become the silent guardian of every Allied soldier. And yet, it remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Even after victory, most soldiers who used the shells never knew what made them so deadly. They only knew this when the sky exploded above the enemy. Victory followed. When the final reports arrived, Dr. Merle Tuve looked over the data, accuracy rates, enemy casualties, production numbers, and finally allowed himself to smile. From the labs of Section T to the frozen forests of Europe, the impossible had been achieved. The proximity fuse wasn't just a weapon. It was a triumph of human intellect over the limits of war itself. But as the guns began to fall silent, a new fear emerged. If such power could be born from science, what came next? April 6, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa. The sea was boiling with war. For weeks, the U.S. Navy had been pounding the island of Okinawa, Japan's last defensive line before the homeland. The air above the fleet shimmered with heat and smoke. Then, from the horizon, came the sound that every sailor had learned to fear. Engines. Dozens of them. Radar screens lit up with blips moving fast, too fast. The alarm bell screamed. Kamikazes inbound. All hands, battle stations. Japanese pilots, some barely 18 years old, had turned their planes into flying bombs. Their mission was death itself. Each carried a 500-pound explosive, guided only by will and faith. They came low, weaving through anti-aircraft fire, determined to die for the Emperor. And for the men aboard the ships below, survival depended on a weapon most of them didn't even understand: the proximity fuse. April 16, 1945. The destroyer USS Laffey was stationed off Okinawa when more than 50 Japanese aircraft descended upon her. The sky erupted in chaos. Pilots screamed their final prayers as they dove straight at the ship. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, thousands of shells ripping through the sky. But this time it wasn't just blind fire. Each shell was guided by invisible radar waves, sensing the enemy, exploding precisely as the planes entered their killing range. Japanese aircraft disintegrated mid-dive, torn apart before they could strike. The Laffey was hit again and again, yet she refused to sink. Her gunners, firing proximity fuse shells, brought down 9 kamikazes and damaged 11 more. One sailor later said, voice trembling, "It was like the air itself was fighting for us." From April to June 1945, Japan launched over 1,500 suicide attacks against the Allied fleet. The sky turned into a slaughterhouse. Without the proximity fuse, the U.S. Navy would have been overwhelmed. Traditional fuses couldn't stop fast-moving kamikazes. By the time a shell exploded, the plane was already crashing into its target. But with proximity fuses, the defense became lethal. Every ship's gun, from 5-inch cannons to quad 40mm mounts, became an intelligent wall of fire. Japanese pilots flew into storms of perfectly timed explosions. Engines shredded, wings torn away, they never even reached their targets. Admiral Richmond Turner later wrote, "If we had fought Okinawa without the VT fuse, we would have lost half our fleet." The weapon that began as a desperate experiment in Washington had become the shield of the Pacific. Inside a bunker deep beneath the Imperial Palace, Japanese officers studied reports from Okinawa. Losses were catastrophic. Their pilots never made it through the American defenses. Admiral Agaki slammed his fist on the table. The Americans have found a way to make the air explode. No one understood how. Japanese engineers tried to recover fragments of unexploded shells, but none revealed the secret. The truth, that each shell carried a miniature radar brain, was beyond anything they imagined. They called it the American Ghost Fuse. As the Okinawa battle raged, U.S. commanders studied the fuse's performance. The results were staggering. Kamikaze success rates dropped by nearly 70%. Anti-aircraft accuracy increased 5-fold. Thousands of American sailors' lives were saved. Rear Admiral W.R. Purnell sent a coded message to Washington. The proximity fuse is now the single most valuable defensive weapon in the Pacific. In a war defined by terror and sacrifice, it had become the difference between life and death. When the guns finally fell silent, the U.S. Navy counted its losses. Dozens of ships damaged, thousands of sailors dead. But it could have been far worse. Okinawa had proven one thing. The proximity fuse wasn't just a weapon. It was a guardian angel forged from science and desperation. For every ship saved, for every life spared, there was a scientist in Washington, a technician in a dusty factory, or a woman in a lab coat assembling fragile circuits by hand. They didn't wear uniforms. They never saw the front lines. But without them, there would be no victory. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan to its knees. The emperor surrendered. The guns finally went silent. But among the countless innovations that defined the war, radar, the jet engine, the atomic bomb, one invention remained in the shadows. The tiny, unseen fuse that had quietly changed the balance of power. Dr. Merle and his team at Section T were finally allowed to reveal their work. The world learned that inside every proximity fuse shell was a miniature radar transmitter capable of surviving 20,000 GS of acceleration, a feat that no one had thought possible. In the chaos of global war, they had built one of the first smart weapons, and few even knew their names. When the war ended, Allied scientists studied the data. The proximity fuse had destroyed over half of all enemy aircraft shot down by naval gunfire in the Pacific. It had turned the tide at Okinawa, saved countless ships, and paved the way for the modern era of guided munitions. The Japanese never truly understood what had hit them. They believed the Americans had harnessed some form of magic. But it wasn't magic. It was science, pure, relentless human genius. And it was born not in a battlefield trench, but in a laboratory. As the last ships returned home, sailors looked out over calm seas that had once been graveyards. They had survived the impossible. And though they never saw the faces of the people who saved them, they carried a silent truth. Sometimes, victory doesn't come from the soldier who fires the gun, but from a mind that makes the bullet smarter. January 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The world was freezing. Snow fell in thick silence over the wreckage of burned-out tanks and shattered trees. The German army, desperate and cornered, had launched one final, brutal offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. American troops were trapped in the woods near Bastogne, surrounded, low on supplies, and facing relentless German artillery. The sky was dark, clouds too thick for Allied aircraft. For days, the men fought blind, unable to see the enemy, but feeling death rain down around them. Then, on Christmas Eve, the weather broke. The clouds lifted, and the U.S. Army Air Forces unleashed their vengeance. But this time, their shells were not ordinary. They carried the secret that had changed the Pacific, the proximity fuse. Until that winter, the proximity fuse had been one of America's most tightly guarded secrets. It was feared that if even one unexploded shell was recovered by the Germans, the technology could be copied, or worse, countered. But by late 1944, General Eisenhower had made his decision. Use them. The risk is worth the reward. Within days, proximity fuse shells were being rushed to frontline artillery units across Europe. The effect was instant and devastating. When American gunners opened fire, German troops, diving for cover behind ridges and trees, found no safety. The shells no longer had to hit the ground. They exploded above it, raining shrapnel in perfect lethal patterns. An Army captain later said, "It was like God had turned on a light switch. The enemy just vanished." Germany's last air offensive. Hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters attacked Allied airfields across Belgium and France, hoping to destroy the air superiority that had crushed them. But what the German pilots didn't know was that the skies were now guarded by proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. When the first wave of Messerschmitts roared over Allied lines, the guns opened up, and the air itself seemed to detonate. Explosions burst within meters of their targets, tearing through wings and cockpits. Pilots bailed out, their planes falling like black snow. The Luftwaffe lost 277 aircraft in a single day, a blow from which it would never recover. A British commander later remarked, "For the first time, we could see our shells thinking." Though the front lines were moving east toward Germany, Britain was still under attack. One flying bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapons, screamed across the sky toward London. Interceptors struggled to stop them. Anti-aircraft guns fired relentlessly, but the small, fast-moving rockets often slipped through. Then came the order, deploy the proximity fuse. Within days, the effect was dramatic. Gun batteries that had been shooting down one in every 80 V1s now destroyed one in every 4. Londoners noticed the difference. The nightly terror began to fade. One Londoner wrote in her diary, "For months, we lived in fear of the sound. Now, at last, the sky fights back." As Allied forces stormed across the Rhine, the war in Europe neared its end. But deep in the ruins of German cities, Allied intelligence teams searched desperately, looking for any sign that the Axis had discovered the Fuze's secret. They found none. Captured scientists stared in disbelief when the device was finally shown to them. A miniature radar transmitter, small enough to fit in a shell, yet strong enough to survive the fury of being fired. One German engineer whispered, "We thought such a thing was impossible." It wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that technology, when driven by desperation and genius, could leap years ahead of its time. The guns fell silent across Europe. Crowds danced in the streets. Soldiers cheered, cried, and prayed. The war that had consumed the world was finally over. But amid the celebrations, the scientists who had built the proximity fuse stayed quiet. Their work had been so secret that few even knew their names. Dr. Merle Tuve, Vannevar Bush, and the men and women of Section T had accomplished the impossible and then vanished into history. As General George Marshall later said, the proximity fuse shortened the war by months, perhaps by years. It saved London, it saved our fleets, and it saved countless lives. When peace returned, the fuse became the foundation of a new era. Its principles, radar sensing, automatic detonation, electronic guidance, became the building blocks for missiles, satellites, and even space exploration. From the forests of Belgium to the seas of Okinawa, its legacy was written not in ink, but in smoke and fire. It was the first of the smart weapons, the ancestor of every precision-guided missile and bomb that followed. Yet for all its genius, it carried a heavy truth. That even in victory, the line between defense and destruction had forever blurred. War pushes humanity to its limits, to create, to destroy, to survive. The proximity fuse was born from fear, but it became a symbol of what human minds can achieve when there is no other choice. For every soldier it saved, another fell because of it. For every city it protected, another burned. And in the silence after the war, that contradiction lingered. The cost of progress paid in blood. Because the fuse didn't just change the battlefield. It changed what it meant to fight. August 1945, the world stands still. In the weeks after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the air itself seemed heavier. The war had ended, but victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like silence. A silence filled with questions. Across the world, the scientists who had built the machines of war, the radar, the jet, the bomb, the fuse, began to ask the same thing. What have we done? The proximity fuse, once a secret so powerful it could turn the tide of battle, was now a blueprint for the future of weapons, a future that frightened even its own creators. Dr. Merle Tuve sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of reports stamped top secret. For years, he had worked without recognition, building the impossible. Now, he was being honored as a hero, but all he could think about were the faces of the men who'd used his invention. He had seen the test films, the glowing arcs of shells, the bursts of fire over the Pacific. He had read the after-action reports from Okinawa, from Bastogne, from the North Sea. Every paragraph ended with the same line: enemy destroyed, target neutralized. And yet, Tuve couldn't celebrate. He told a colleague quietly, "We made a machine that could think for a second, and in that second it decided life and death." For the first time, science had created a weapon that didn't need a man's trigger finger to kill. When the fuse was finally declassified, newspapers across America called it the little brain that won the war. Magazines printed pictures of tiny circuits and glass tubes, praising the ingenuity that had saved fleets and cities. But buried beneath the celebration was something darker: realization. The proximity fuse had proven that machines could make decisions in combat faster than humans. And if a machine could think about when to explode, one day another machine could decide who to kill. The fuse wasn't just an invention. It was the beginning, the first step toward the age of autonomous warfare. As the US and Soviet Union turned from allies to adversaries, both sides raced to develop weapons inspired by the fuse's principles. Missiles that could guide themselves, bombs that could sense their targets, defense systems that could act before soldiers even saw the enemy. The same technology that had once saved London now guarded the world under a new shadow: the threat of nuclear annihilation. Scientists who had worked on Section T were divided. Some joined the military research programs that followed. Others walked away forever. Dr. Tuve refused to work on atomic weapons. He returned to astrophysics, dedicating his life to studying the heavens instead of destroying what lay beneath them. When asked years later why he left, he said softly, "I saw what happens when knowledge runs faster than wisdom." While the world rebuilt, the proximity fuse quietly shaped everything that came next. From the radar-guided missiles of Korea to the precision systems of Vietnam, its descendants filled the arsenals of modern war. Yet few remembered the people who made it possible. The men and women who worked 18-hour days in secret labs. The technicians who assembled fragile tubes by hand, never knowing what they were for. The sailors who fought and survived because of an unseen spark inside a shell. History rarely spoke their names, but every radar-guided weapon that followed carried their fingerprint. 2 decades after the war, veterans gathered at reunions, gray-haired and slower now. When they spoke about Okinawa or the Bulge, they remembered the noise, the thunder of guns, the light in the sky, the smell of burnt cordite. And somewhere in those memories was a strange kind of gratitude, not just for survival, but for the invisible minds that had given them a chance. One old gunner said, "We never saw the people who made those fuses, but we owed them our lives." He paused, then added quietly, "And maybe they owed us theirs." The proximity fuse was more than a weapon. It was a mirror, showing humanity what it could achieve and what it might destroy in the process. It marked the birth of smart warfare, the dawn of machines that could make their own deadly choices. But it also stood as proof of something beautiful. That in the darkest hours of history, human minds refused to give up. That science, even when forged for war, came from the same spark that built bridges, cured disease, and reached the stars. Every great invention carries a question. What will we do with the power we've created? The proximity fuse ended one war, but it also began a new one, fought in silence, inside laboratories, in the hearts of those who understood what it meant. Because when science learned to fight, it also learned to fear itself. So as we look back at the fuse that thought, that killed, that saved, remember this: the true power of invention isn't in destruction. It's in choice. And history will always remember the moment when humanity first gave its weapons a mind and wondered if it had gone too far. Before you leave this story behind, take a moment to think. Every advancement, every new weapon, every brilliant idea that changes the world comes with a price. The question isn't how powerful we can become, but whether we can remain human enough to handle that power.